I think I have had a very complete life, and I hope that what I leave and what my children leave to the next generations will maintain the same values that were established by my husband: excellence, rigor, innovation, quality. I felt that it was important. The story of Hovione should be told for future generations, not only of the family, but I'm sure there are many people at Hovione who give their best, who give their all day after day to ensure that we progress and we develop and that we're successful. And I know that many of them would like to know how it all began and how it developed. I was born in Portugal. I spent the war in England, which I feel was very formative. I feel that those years until 1944 were difficult, obviously, and I returned, went to school here, grew up here. And of course, in those days, girls were brought up to know how to read and write, and languages perhaps, but the objective was to get married and have children and be a good housewife. My grandmother, she was English, and she was very practical. She was the one who said, you know, Diane, yeah, you grow up, you get married, you be a housewife, but just in case, you'd better be able to work and earn your living at the same time. And so I was sent to a secretarial college where I learnt to type and do shorthand and a little accountants. And so, in fact, I did work from 1954 to 1957 in office. So I touched on non-ferrous metals, on electronics, on pharmaceutical specialties, on veterinary products. It was endless. It was hard work, but I learned a lot. And it was so lucky that I did, because if I hadn't learned all of that, I would never have been able to take over all the administrative part, which I ran for at least 35 years. Before going into the story of Hovione, I would like to describe my husband as I knew him. Obviously, the all-important figure in this story. He was a Hungarian chemical engineer, and he had arrived in Portugal in 1951 after having had to leave Hungary in 1948 when the communist regime took over the governing of the state. He was very knowledgeable. He had a brilliant mind, very innovative, full of optimism. He had total self-confidence in his knowledge. He was always looking ahead, looking forward. If this didn't work, something else would, not to worry. And I think he was able to transmit that self-confidence and that optimism to all the people who worked with us. And to this day, there's great optimism, and we really believe that we will be successful if we follow the values that he initiated: innovative, strive always for excellence, quality is essential, beware, remember that safety is so essential because you're dealing with chemical products. And of course, we always were protected by his independent processes of production, which had been patented. For many years, I remember we'd been working together maybe for 30, 35, 40 years. People would come to us and say, you work together, and you're still married, and you can still look at each other. And I said, yes. two Hungarian acquaintances of my husband approached him with a proposal that would involve my husband working with an Italian firm already producing chlortetracycline, which was the earlier tetracyclines, but they had no IP, no intellectual property. And my husband would help them that way. They got together, the firm was formed, the name deriving from the first syllable of the surnames of the three initial partners, Ho for Horthy, V for Villax, and On for Onodi, who was the other one. After the 3 initial years, the two Hungarian partners, who had never taken an active part in the operation, decided they would go further afield and look for greener pastures. We paid them out, they were satisfied, and we were left just the two of us alone. We looked at each other and we decided that we would go into the segment of APIs, which is active pharmaceutical ingredients for the pharmaceutical industry, because he had knowledge in that, he had patents. And looking at Portugal, a small country, 10 million inhabitants, we decided there and then that the world would be our market. A bit naive, perhaps, because in fact we were entering a global market which was already very mature. There were many players. But not to worry, we were optimistic and he was knowledgeable. So we there and then decided to divide the work. My husband obviously would be the inventor, the producer, and the salesman, and I took hold of all the administrative part of the work, specifically finance, imports and exports, because everything had to be imported, and our idea was to export everything. So that involved a lot of bureaucratic work. In those days, it was very complicated. I mean, the world was not a global village as it is today. And this continued for many years. We established, right from the beginning, the work ethics we would follow. We would be innovative. We would work on complex compounds. We would always have our own IP, which would protect our production and our business. We would strive for excellence, and quality would be all important. I had to deal with the banks, which wasn't easy. I mean, in those days, there weren't many girls, who had to deal with the banks and get credit lines and decide on interest and spreads and make sure that repayments were made on time. But I got used to it, and over the years I was very meticulous. I complied with procedures. You have to tick off your statement daily. You have to confirm in writing anything you discuss over the telephone, and I always did that. He had confidence in himself. He had started his firm. He knew it would be successful in the long run, and he just didn't want to work for anyone else. He had his own ideas, and he wanted to be his own boss. We started in the basement. My husband had it equipped with safety in mind. I mean, we needed to have this approval by the local fire brigade before we could start operation. And he knew that all the plugs and all the electricity, everything had to be explosion-proof, fire-proof. There was one moment of anxiety when he ordered from Germany what was supposed to be an explosion-proof dryer, because you put the product in this equipment and close it, and it dries out all the humidity, solvent, whatever is still retained in the product before it becomes crystalline and you sell it. and it exploded. White powder all over the place, a mess. No one was hurt. But of course the fire brigade arrived because they heard this enormous bang coming from a basement. But when they arrived, everything had been, there was no problem. And my husband, always ingenious, he got hold of the local carpenter, and he had a cupboard made in plywood that opened with 2 doors and had slats on which the trays of product would be placed for drying. And then from above, he had 2 hairdryers, local domestic hairdryers, connected to the electricity, and the hot air from the hairdryers dried the equipment. We never had a problem after that. My children were good. When they came home, they did their homework. They didn't need a lot of supervising, you know. As my daughter once said to a stranger who mentioned, "How did I cope?" And a little voice said, "Mummy has her infrastructure." I think I did organize myself. I was an organized person. To begin with, I worked alone, and then my husband got a secretary because the patent work involved an awful lot of typing. And then we took on a young man who would do all the outside work, you know, the local purchases, the banks, the post office, and then bit by bit, 5 of my husband's previous colleagues from Institut Pasteur joined us. I'm always proud to relate because they left a very good job, very stable atmosphere, to come to what was really a start-up. It was very courageous of them, but I don't think they regretted it. They stayed with us till their retirement many decades later. I remember one month we hadn't sold enough, and I realized that there was not going to be enough for the salaries that month. Not to worry, we went into my drawer and pulled out all the bits that I had already received and that I had, and we went off to a local pawn shop, got sufficient money to pay for the salaries. And I think after about 3 or 4 months, everything was retrieved. And after that, we never had a problem in paying salaries. We started with hydrocortisone, we went through prednisolone, and by the time the Japanese arrived on our doorstep, we were producing betametazone, which was more advanced, very expensive, very complex. In those days in Japan, there was no production of pharmaceutical ingredients. They only formulated. So they had to buy from abroad the actual active ingredient. And they had gone to the chemical abstracts and found that my husband, Diane Villax, had these independent processes duly patented for the products that they were interested in. The Japanese market, why were we successful? We were successful because we had very good technology, we had this robust IP, and our quality was extremely good. I remember clients coming to the house and discussing with my husband potential purchase of this, that, or the other, and then complaining and saying, "Well, yes, but your price really is too high." And he would just say, "I'm so sorry, but my quality is so much better. If you want lower price, maybe you will have to try another country." But he never reduced his price because he knew his quality was very good. And that is important to mention because today, 50 years later, the clients come to us because our quality is known internationally. In addition to Japan, which of course was our initial main export market, we also sold quite a lot to Taiwan. And we would export the little packages of 50, 100 grams of cortisones or betametazones, and they would pay us, they would send us a check in payment. And the first time I received a check from them, Everything was written in Chinese. Everything except the actual figures. Addressed to whom, drawn on which bank, the amount, everything was written in Chinese. And what's more, the checks seem to have been endorsed several times behind. I mean, you know, I don't know how many times it had gone from one hand to another. And so I had to hand it into the bank and ask them to discount it. But I was a bit wary that it might be sent back to me as undecipherable. But no, they credited us and there was never a problem. It never bounced. By the end of 1969, we seemed to have enough cash and spare credit. And here I must just tell you a little story about my husband. Once when asked if he had any ready cash, he said, "I don't really need any ready cash. As long as I have a little spare credit, I'm okay." And sure enough, I mean, it is true, isn't it? And so we decided that on this land that we'd already bought in Lourdes, just outside Lourdes, we would build our first industrial building. And it's called B1, and to this day, it just goes to show that if you really design your building, build it carefully and strongly, and maintain it regularly, you can use an industrial building for decades. It's still producing. And so we got started, and within about a year and a half, we were operational, and after that, bit by bit, we developed as the years went by and our markets increased. We found it was necessary to build successive industrial buildings and then pilot plants. And then, of course, we needed to add social buildings for the canteen, cafeteria, and everything that goes with having a certain number of team members. From the very beginning, my husband always insisted that if any of our clients contested by anyone invoking infringement of patent, he should participate in the defense. And so it came. A small English company called Burke Pharmaceuticals was contested by American Cyanamide, a vast conglomerate. In England, they had bought chlortetracycline from the Italian company, and American Cyanamide said they were infringing a certain patent of theirs. My husband was called up as witness, and so convincing, and had all his notebooks, date by date, that in the end, Burke won the case, and not only did they win, but American Cyanide's patent, which had been invoked, was revoked. It was considered not valid. So I think it was, you know, it was the first of several victories. He worked till the very end. I mean, his last patent is dated 2003. He was very innovative. I mean, he was just bubbling with invention until he died, yes. I remember having to go to a furniture shop called Olayu. I had to buy some desks and some chairs. And the young man said, "And who shall I invoice?" And I said, "Hovione." And he said, "Oh, do you work at Hovione?" I said, "Well, I own Hovione." "Oh," he said, "I have a friend who works there. They actually treat the people as human beings," which was nice to hear, you know. Another story, a telephone line to Japan in the 60s was very expensive. I remember night after night, because of the 8-hour difference, he would work during the day on any problem that they had, and then at night he would come home and he would dictate to me the answer to their queries, and I would have to type really fast the answer that he was dictating to me. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping was in charge in China, and he decided that he would open the gates of China to world commerce. And in those days, this Canton Fair existed and had existed for many years. It happened in the spring and the autumn, so we decided we would go to the autumn Canton Fair of 1978. The following day, we had our appointment, and we were four of us, because we were my husband and myself, and we had our salesman with us and our agent from Hong Kong. So we were four. Sure enough, four Chinese officials from the government entity turned up, and we discussed. And at the end of the meeting, believe it or not, when we got up to say goodbye, one of the four knew we had come from Portugal and spoke Portuguese. And after that, we developed this business, and to this day, we buy a lot of raw materials from China. As a result of this, we set up an office in Hong Kong in 1979 because we needed Chinese-speaking people who could go to China and eventually visit the factories, which were dispersed all over that vast country. We'd started off with this, such an important market, starting from the mid-60s right through the 70s, Japan. I mean, it was comparable to the US market today. It was so important, or more so. And we had developed all that Pacific Rim. We worked in Taiwan, we sold in South Korea, a little in Thailand, and quite substantially in Australia already. Very often we would stop, and we went to India many, many times. Bit by bit, we started discovering suppliers in India. We enjoyed the East. We enjoyed going east. As from India onwards, we went to Burma for pleasure, and we went to Indochina, all over Indochina for pleasure. Very fascinating, I find it. We had clients who wanted to buy our doxycycline, Hyclate, and according to the regulatory authorities in the United States, no American company can import a raw material, an active ingredient for their final medicine, without the factory where it is being produced having been approved. So we had to apply for inspection from the FDA. They came in 1982. And the innovator's patent expired in the summer of '82, and literally within a week, we had arrived at the FDA with our samples for approval. And we started producing. The market was vast, rigorous, very competitive. But they do recognize service and quality. Of course, our market survey hadn't realized the dimension of the market. And I remember in 1983, I think there were quite a number of people who didn't have holidays that year, because we just had to produce continuously in order to comply with our delivery promises for all these orders that came rolling in. And to this day, the American market is our most important market. A banker called Hovione managed to convince my husband that Macau would be the ideal place to have this new factory. Guy was sent out with instructions to deal with the authorities, find a plot of land of at least 5,000 square meters, which wasn't easy, it's a small territory, and find a builder and build this factory and install it and get it running. Well, little did we know how difficult it was going to be. I mean, in Macau, there was nothing. So we decided we would supply from Europe all that was required. Everything had to be planned so that it could be taken to Rotterdam, where the cargo ships to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, the whole thing had to be transferred onto barges because there was no deep sea port in Macau. And the things had to arrive at the right time for the builder to incorporate them in his construction. Logistically, it was very complex, but it was very cleverly done. Within 14 months, Guy got the plant built and installed, and quite a number of Portuguese operators had to go there to begin with because there was no one local we could employ, no one understood our equipment. Guy was there. Guy laid very solid foundations, very good procedures. And to this day, the factory operates really very, very well indeed. Their right first time is over 99%, which is extraordinary. And they live the values. I visit them every year. I've been going for over 30 years every year to celebrate with them those who complete 10, 20, and last year there were 4 of them completing 30 years with us, which was a major festivity, as you can imagine. By the 80s, my children began to grow up. They'd completed university. The first was the eldest son, Peter. He joined the firm in 81, 82, after spending 6 months in California. And he returned very enthusiastic about computer science. It was just beginning. And he thought that Hovione should really start working in this field. It's a tool that helps in every direction. He drew up our first network, the website, quite advanced in those days in computer-wise. Peter has always been a very good speaker. He has great facility. He speaks English, Portuguese, French beautifully. And so both within Portugal and abroad, he has participated in many meetings, many conferences. He knows the business in great depth. And as of the past, he is head of the Portuguese Association for Family Enterprises. And there again, he can join up the family enterprise with Hovione, and it has been a great asset to have had him talk on our behalf. Sophia completed her studies in England in pharmacology, and after a short period in Lourdes, she went out to Macau in 1986. I think she stayed about three or 4 years. She was director of quality, and she was certainly there and prepared the site for the first FDA inspection. This gentleman had arrived, I think, from China, where he'd probably seen too much of what he didn't want to see. In those days, everything was very primitive in China still. And he didn't realize that Macau was not just an extension. And he arrived and he said, well, you've built this in 14 months, you've been in operation for 6, and you've applied for an FDA inspection. We will have to see how it goes. So my daughter was somewhat anxious about the result, but it was very satisfactory, and we were considered approvable. Miguel was always very independent. He never wanted to be part of the company, but he helped us. He went out to Hong Kong and Macau in 1990, and he established a multi-data system platform with many applications. He managed an email service between Hovione Macau and Hovione Hong Kong way back in 1991, 1992, which was very, very early. I mean, Microsoft hadn't got there yet at all. They could communicate with each other. My husband, as he always said, left with his diploma in his hand and the Russians on his heels, because this was 1948. It was after they had had first parliamentary elections in Hungary, and somehow the whole thing had been so distorted that this communist party had managed to collect enough votes to obtain the 3 essential ministries to run a country, which are justice, defense, and internal administration. They had those 3 vital ministries. And my father-in-law, who was a university professor, he didn't like the situation, and he let it be known. And he was told gently that maybe he would have to pipe down or else he might end up in Siberia. So he decided neither was any good, and he didn't tell his children, but he did tell his wife that he was planning to leave. And so it was his 49th birthday on the 23rd of September 1948. And so they celebrated his birthday, and the following day he had everything in plan, and he told his 4 sons, my husband was the eldest, that they were leaving that night. And so they left by the dark of night. The town where they lived was very near the Austrian border, so they quite easily got over the border. But of course they got into the Russian sector of Austria, because in those days Austria was still divided into 4 sectors. So they had to get through the Russian sector, which they succeeded in doing. And then they stayed in Austria for some months before my father-in-law was invited to work in Clermont-Ferrand, Institut de Recherche Agricole, because he was a plant genetist. And all the family went. Then they came to Portugal in 1950, and my husband followed in 1951. But he had always said that he would not return to Hungary whilst it was under the communist regime. So he didn't dream that he would ever go back. But suddenly, as you all know, 1989, 1990, the whole thing collapsed. And so in 1990, April, we set off to Austria. With us came Guy and Sophia, because they decided it was going to be very emotional, and they'd better come along too to lighten up the atmosphere. And so we went to see his old house, which was inhabited by 5 different families. Then we continued on to Budapest, and he went to visit his university. In 1992, his university invited him for a meeting with a view to giving him a full doctorate based on his life's work. So he was there surrounded by, no doubt, a number of professors, and they discussed for quite a number of hours. And after that, they gave him his full doctorate, and they invited him to be a member of the university's Senate. He was very proud of his PhD in chemistry, and it was a wonderful moment for him to be recognized by his university. We signed a protocol. He started taking on these trainees during his lifetime, but then after he died, we formalized it with a protocol, and we accept 1 or 2, depending on who wants to come, postgraduate students who come here for a school year, and they work on projects that we are interested in. They work in our R&D department. He was always very focused on the environment, because he knew he had a chemical factory, which made him all the more concerned in taking care that not only we would do the utmost not to pollute, but we would really take action to the contrary. And in 1991, we built this recycling plant for our solvents, because we used a lot of solvents in production, and these tons of solvents are extracted from the final product, so something has to be done with them. This recycling plant was well designed, and it operated very efficiently, and in fact our acetone was good enough to be reincorporated in our production. That was, from one point of view, very satisfactory. The environment was just beginning to pick up, and the European community would subsidize people who spent money on helping the environment. But the government, when they heard that we were reusing the acetone that we had recouped in our production, they said, no, you're not getting a grant, because It's a productive unit, not a recycling unit. You reuse it in your industrial manufacture. We had discovered that annually the European community had a competition called Better Industrial Environment. And within that competition, there were various categories. And we decided that we would compete in the category of waste recovery. And sure enough, we got the 1992 prize for waste recovery from the European Union, which I think was, very, very satisfactory. In about 1993, 1994, we decided we would initiate our operation into a new segment of the market, which was contrast media. And so we built this very large, state-of-the-art building. When it was ready, our agent suddenly decided that contrast media was a no-no because it was a product that was only purchased by hospitals. And they had their suppliers, and there was no changing their way of buying suddenly by a small Portuguese firm. So that was rather despairing, but not to worry. Simultaneously, there was this small firm called Hungarian who had received approval. They had no industrial facility, and it was a product to help HIV patients called Villax. And so they came to us, and they said they were in a hurry. And so we said, well, it's going to take a few months, but we will give you building number 15. We will get it ready, and it'll be ready for you within the period that you are requesting. And so we're nimble, we're flexible, we got everything in order, and sure enough, the date came and we were ready, and that was another great success. Guy, having returned in 1990, spent his first period here really working on these programs that had to be submitted in order to receive the grants and the subsidies from the CE, and which involved a lot of work. Everything had to be very detailed, and we had to comply with all the requirements of the project. In 1995, my husband had to undergo a very delicate operation, and he decided that he would name Guy as CEO. But Guy, with a lot of wisdom, and knowing that there were other people on the team who had already been working for a long time, had technical knowledge, had experience, and maybe wanted to make sure that the transition would be smooth, and Guy had indeed the capacity. He waited till 1997 before actually taking on the situation, and at that time he brought a lot of innovation with him. He was young. We started with our shifts, 3 shifts, so as to occupy the equipment 24 hours. It was very expensive. This state-of-the-art equipment that you require for pharmaceuticals is very, very expensive. And so unless you're using it to full advantage, you're wasting your capital investment. She's a strong young girl. She came back to Europe. She married, she had children, and then she returned to work with us in 1998 in the communications and branding department. By that time, we wanted really to expand the name of Hovione and no longer work through agents everywhere. And she was very, very successful in setting up this communications and branding department. She worked for about 10 years, and then she went on to being innovation manager of the company, and she established a number of programs together with the universities, which have proved very successful. Peter had asthma as a young boy, and he invented a series of medicinal inhalers. They're called medical devices inhalers, which were very simple to use, very cheap to produce. And he managed to patent them. And there was one he licensed to a Japanese firm, and it has brought to the company over $30 million so far in royalties, which is very substantial. He has a very, very clever mind, and he has great knowledge now because he's been working since the 80s or 90s on these inhalation devices. So he has gone a long way. Miguel spent quite a long time in Macau, and when he returned, he had his own little firm. And here in Portugal, as from 2001 until the present day, he also established a computerized data system which had many different applications connected to it, and which are still operational today. And as of the past few weeks, Hovione has decided that we have to really look to the future in this field, and Miguel is in charge of establishing a well-founded, well-thought-out new system which will be transversal, all the different departments, so that we're prepared for what we know is coming, the difficulties that this field of the IT field is confronted with in every direction. By the middle of the 90s, Guy, again, realized that the small biotechs and large pharma were discovering new molecules which, after a certain amount of consideration, they decided would be a success when they were eventually approved. And they were interested in this research, and they were interested in the final distribution of the medicine. But the long period in between, which is the development period, which can last 5, 7, 10 years, it can take a long time, because you've got phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, you've got your clinicals, and all this is very rigorous. You can succeed in your phase 1, pass to phase 2. In toxicology, it doesn't go. In pharmacology, it drops. Along the way, there are many stages because the requirements become more and more rigorous. The product can fall dead. But we thought we had found a niche in this, and sure enough, bit by bit, we let it be known, and the companies started coming to us, and we would discuss with them, and if their specification, if we felt we had the know-how, the methodology, the technologies required, the equipment, we would sign with them, and we would offer them the service of the development as opposed to selling the product. So we had two segments, the products and the services. And to this day, we continue with the products and the services. And today, our revenues are 50-50. I mean, both sides are equivalent, which is very satisfactory. Guy has understood the responsibility that the pharmaceutical industry has towards society. And he started with this, these fake medicines really took on a very fatal and dramatic aspect in the 90s, with people dying from these fake medicines that were coming from the Far East. He set up a group called the EFCG, European Fine Chemicals Group, which operated in Brussels. It was a small group, and the idea was to lobby the European Parliament to get them to bring forward the requirement, much greater surveillance and requirements and severity towards the import of all medicines, especially when the origin was unknown. Marisa Matias, Portuguese EMP of the left-wing bloc, she submitted a proposal for European directive to the Parliament, and it was approved. So it was a very good first step towards greater legislation in regard to fake medicines. Opposition was brought in America against the FDA, saying that they were not protecting the Americans sufficiently with regard to fake medicines. And they asked Europe to send someone who would speak on their behalf. And so the European fine chemical industry decided that Guy would be the spokesperson, and he spoke in Congress. And he just said, the people are complaining about the FDA not protecting the people sufficiently, but my opinion is that the FDA is an excellent organization. In Europe, we have to cope with 28 different organizations. The problem is probably lack of finance, because suddenly you have thousands of these API manufacturers in the Far East, and it isn't possible for the present group of inspectors who exist to cope with such vast quantities. As a result of all his activity and his knowledge and experience, Guy has become respected within the pharmaceutical field worldwide. He's invited to speak at many conferences a year. His opinion is requested. And it's very much because he realizes, in addition to what he has experienced and his knowledge, that we have this responsibility towards society. In 2003, my husband died. He was too young to die. He had still so much to give, so much up there that could have come out. And Guy had to take over. And he took over a small family business, and he turned it into a family enterprise with industrial plants on 3 continents. A whole lot of people with different ways of thinking, different values, different religions, different races. And it can't be easy. I mean, you need a lot of wisdom to be able to get everyone to pull in the same direction and to believe in the same values and have the same determination, to strive for excellence as we try and get it over. When Guy took over in 2003, he suddenly realized that he was still very young and he had no one to report to. And so we decided we would set up a board of directors at the top level, which would comprise a majority of outside independent directors. And since then, this board has grown bigger and even more professional, because now there are 3 family members. The board consists of 8. My daughter, Sophia, in 2016 was invited onto the board, and we have 5 outside independent directors. We have a governance and ethics committee, a nomination and remuneration committee, audit, finance and risk committee. We just want to become ever more professional and transparent, because in this day and age, it's rather important that you do. It's a very good tagline because it has so many meanings. We are in it for life. And this in it for life means that we're here for the duration. As a family business, we can look 5-10 years ahead. We're here to remain. On the other hand, the meaning can be that we're in it to save lives. We're in it to help patients with the medicines that we produce. We have the privilege to serve patients and help them regain their health. So I think it was well thought, and it has great meaning, and it will last for a long time. I think that over the past 2 years, we have had this very, very intensive expansion project. Here in Portugal, we now employ over 1,000 people. It's so important that those who arrive, if they don't understand, they should ask, and those who have been here with us longer should be prepared to help them and convey to them their knowledge that they have gained over the years. And we want everyone who works here to feel satisfaction in their job, to feel that what they do is useful, that everyone, whatever task they have, they constitute a link in this chain that is the Hovione team. Their knowledge is important to us. The sky is the limit.